All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for being able to make it. Sorry for rescheduling it from last week, and thanks for being so flexible and being able to do that. I'm glad to see everybody, and it sounds like everybody generally fared okay after the storm. So I'm really, maybe not all the trees did, but it looks like everyone did okay. So I'm very thankful that everyone's all right. And thanks for coming to this meeting. Again, we do have a full agenda. Couple things before we get started, just that we do have a long meeting. Please take breaks as you need to. That's one of the beauties of Zoom. We have some flexibility. So if you need to get a drink of water or what have you, please do that. And when we get into our interactive session a little bit later, we'll have some time to kind of scoot in a couple of minutes to take a break and walk around, because we have a lot to talk about today. It's going to be pretty intense discussion tonight. So with that, I'm going to get into the presentation, and we can go from there. One of the other things I did want to mention is that part of the packet that we included had some of the FAQs, or the questions that folks had submitted kind of over the last few weeks, couple months since our last meeting. So we wanted to put together responses to those questions. If committee members or folks have other questions, that's sort of a living document, and we can keep adding to that. So thanks so much for that. And we're going to get to kind of some time to go over some of those questions if there's still some other questions that committee members have towards the end of the meeting. So, but thanks for submitting all those. I hope they were helpful for people to review those and get some more understanding of the project from a questions and answers sort of perspective. All right, so we're going to get into, I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to ask you all if you can see it, and hopefully you will all say yes. So is everyone seeing a presentation, I hope? Great. Okay.
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So welcome to the meeting. Again, I know we've done a few of these, but if you wouldn't mind muting yourself kind of during the presentations till we're talking or till we're having a conversation. CPIC members, if you could use the raise your hand or type a question into the chat if you have a question. Folks, audience members, we're all in the same meeting, but if you could use the chat function if you have a question. And then there's also going to be an opportunity to have a lot of conversation in the breakout rooms later in the meeting. So let's continue on. So again, we have our committee members here. Most of us were able to make it, and we have city staff here from the planning, community development, public works departments. We have our consultants, Marcy McAnally and Kimmy Sloop are here as well, and then there are a few consultants that are on the overall project team that are not here today. So we've got a full crew for our meeting tonight. The objectives of this meeting, we're going to share code concepts for input to get input and feedback from you as the committee members. Folks are going to have opportunity to ask project-related questions so we can build on that FAQ document. And then, of course, we're going to talk a little bit towards the end of the meeting about next steps in the project. We've gone over the committee charge before. We keep this as part of every meeting so that we're all remembering or reminded of what the committee is doing as part of this project. But again, we're trying to we're looking to you to be our liaisons into the community, and of course to interact with staff and the consultant team as we work through this project. The agenda was included as part of your packet. Just chat about this for a minute about introductions, and I'm going over sort of the overview of the process, and then we're going to get right into the meat of this project with the overview of the code concepts. And then later on, we'll be going into an interactive exercise with lots of opportunity for feedback and discussion tonight. Then we're going to summarize all of that, and then we're going to talk, have some more Q&A time to talk about next steps in the project, public engagement, and so forth. All right. One of the things that we wanted to ask you sort of at the beginning right now, and it's not to answer it at the moment, but keep this in the back of your mind as we go through this project or go through the presentation tonight, is do you know what your zoning is for your property where you live? and where the zoning might change in your neighborhood. Can you tell where the zoning changes for your neighborhood? Can you tell where the lot sizes might be different? And how do current development standards work to create a livable place? If you can think about things like setbacks and building height, and just think about that or imagine that in your own neighborhood as we walk through this presentation and then as part of our discussion later on. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to this as part of the breakout sessions. And if you don't know the zoning of your lot, we can look it up for you. So as part of the breakout, so we can do that too. Okay. This is our overall project schedule. We're here sort of in the middle to late February, so we're in this code concepts piece. We are targeting for adoption of the code amendments later in the summer, but that we would be at in public hearings before the Planning Commission and the City Council in late June, early July. So this is kind of where we are right now as part of this project for the overall schedule. So far, we're still on track. And I'm going to, I think, turn this over to Marcy to talk about project updates and where we are. And then we'll get into the meat of this presentation. So Marcy, can I kick this over to you now?
You can. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Great. Thank you for being here this evening. I will just jump right into the presentation so that we can save as much time for asking questions and talking to each other. But first, a couple of updates, things that have happened since we met with you last. We've met with the city's equity manager to understand how to integrate this project with the things that are going on under his management. We've developed the next phase of public engagement. I think you'll be hearing much more about that. It's kind of called Meeting in a Box, and you are all key agents of that. I'm going to talk about the draft map and code concepts tonight, but we will be working on we have been working on them and we'll continue to refine those. And there has been a parking inventory study happening since December. And we've also outlined a draft tree code that's been discussed by the tree board, and we'll continue to work on that. So if we could go to the next slide, Vera, thanks. And then the next one. So this portion of the presentation is about the code concepts. And just as a reminder, the code concepts the purpose of them is to implement the policy mandates that we've identified in the beginning of the project. And I think we have summarized them as three main ideas. Increase the supply of middle or attainable housing and provide equitable access and housing choice for all. Increase the tree canopy and preserve existing trees, and manage parking to enable middle housing and protect trees. The term code concepts probably needs just a little definition. They're a way or strategy that we are going to follow through on to implement the goals of the comprehensive plan and policy mandates. Tonight's meeting is to introduce the code concepts to you and get your feedback on them. This phase takes place between now and mid-April, and will inform the actual adoption-ready code amendments that happen right after that. 6 draft code concepts have been identified. I'm going to go through these. If you could go to the next slide. I'm going to go through a few of these and explain them to you. The way we're also talking about this code update for Milwaukee is as the livability code. Everything that we just talked about, increasing housing choice, increasing the tree canopy and preserving existing trees, and managing parking are all about making livability in Milwaukee even better than it is. So what I'm about to say may seem a little provocative. One of the things we want to do is make zoning a more rational system. And have it be based on lot sizes and the physical context. Say that means the situation, combination of features on a site that would dictate where you might be able to put a building, or if there's a tree that you want to preserve, or if parking is available on the site or on the street. Those are all parts of kind of context that when you are choosing to put a house on, you would have to take all those into account. Zoning right now is as it applies to Milwaukee, in my opinion, it's kind of an outdated system. It's a one-size-fits-all system. It's been in place for the last 50 years. It's been updated very incrementally by the city, and this is a big overhaul. And you've asked us to be bold, so we're going to talk about some bold ideas. Next. And I won't go over each of these. There are 6 code concepts. They were detailed in the code concepts memo. I'm going to go through the 3 that have little asterisks near them. And I'm actually going to start on number 2, which is adopting a form-based approach to amendments, because understanding that concept will make the other concepts more understandable. So a form-based approach is different in zoning than a land use-based approach. Right now, most zoning in the US is land use-based. It says that these uses shall go here and these other uses shall go there, and they're very prescriptive in terms of the uses. The way that many cities are moving is more to a form-based approach, that the majority of rules in the zoning code are more about dimensional standards that govern the shape and size and location of a building and its relationship to the street or to open space, and pay less attention to precisely which use goes in the building. And that is what we're attempting to do with your residential zones, is take a more form-based approach. And to understand how this would work, we've articulated it as a series of things that basically results in a Jello mold. So if you kind of picture a Jello mold while I'm talking about this, I want to walk you through this idea. Picture your lot or any piece of land that has property lines around it. That property lines dictates the lot size. In most cities, in your city, most lots in your residential zones are 5,000 square feet or 7,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet, or they're something slightly above or between those. And then in addition to that setback, in addition to the lot size, you have setbacks, and those are dimensions measured from the property line inward. They're your side yard, your front yard, your backyard. And then in addition, you have a lot coverage maximum. So a building footprint, for example, has to sit within the setbacks, but it can only occupy 35% of the total lot in an R5 zone. And this varies a little bit between the zones. Then if you project that footprint up to your maximum height, you have a shape that dictates where you can put development or where you could put a house. That's a lot of architects and developers call the building envelope. But for this discussion, we're just going to call it the Jello mold. Next. And then in addition to this boxy Jello mold shape, Milwaukee has a provision that is somewhat unusual. Not all cities have done this. And that is called, or it's the generic term for this is a daylight plane. And that means that the closer to the side setback the building might be to the side, to the neighboring lot, it needs to begin to step back at the top. It happens to look like a house shape, but it's not dictating a house shape. It's just a plane. A building can take a stair step pattern in there, or it could take an asymmetrical shape within that. But that daylight plane does protect the neighboring properties, making sure that they get light and sunlight and have solar access. So together, all these things I've just gone through for you are the dimensional standards that currently apply in Milwaukee's code in your residential district. It's this jello mold is intended to be filled with residential uses. Next. And that is really all that's changing under House Bill 2001 is what gets to go inside of the jello mold. It's still going to be residential uses. But if you look at the left side, you'll see what is allowed today in a jello mold. This is a jello mold on a 7,000 square foot lot. What is allowed to go in there today is a single dwelling or a single dwelling and an ADU. In House Bill 2001, in the future, you'd be able to have those plus duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters in that shape. They cannot exceed that shape, but all those other types of housing are now privileged to occupy that space. Next. And we want to plant an idea here that those are your standards today. You can say you could choose to minimally comply with House Bill 2001 and say that this is our envelope, we're going to stick with it, and yes, we're going to comply with all of the housing types that are now required. We'll change our zoning code so that residential uses now encompasses all these other types of housing. But you could also choose to go beyond. There are a number of different ways you could go beyond. You could stretch that building envelope. In the House Bill 2001, there are two paths to take. One is the Oregon Administrative Rules, which is a benchmark. And another is the second path is called the Large City Model Code. And it actually lays out some specific dimensional requirements that you could adopt in whole. And they go a little bit farther than your own building envelope does in terms of allowing a greater envelope. That would be one potential going beyond type of option. Next. Okay, so now that you understand this form approach, I think, and we understand the importance of the lot size, because the lot size does dictate those dimensional standards, it's easier to talk about another code concept, which is ways to simplify the residential zones. Next. So currently you have 8 residential zones there. I think our circle is a little off placed. It's supposed to be circling the things that are colored, generally taupe, beige, shades of yellow. Those are your residential zones. It is the majority of your city that is residentially zoned. We have discussed in the past that an approach might be to simplify or consolidate some of these zones to each other. And these do, let's see, I think the best thing is to go actually to the next slide and talk about where middle housing applies. It's applying to it's kind of easier to look at the zoning code map when it's just the residential areas are highlighted. The duplexes will be permitted on all, you will be required to permit them on all lots. So all the yellow area. And then these other middle housing types will be permitted based on minimum lot size. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting because these other housing types like triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, they're based on a minimum lot size. You're required to permit these housing types that are slightly more in number than the duplex on a 7,000 square foot lot. But 7,000 square foot lots don't, it turns out, always correspond to R7. So if we go to the next slide, we can show you a little sample patch. In an R5 zone, you will actually find quite a few 7,000 square foot lots. That's the minimum lot size for the R7 zone, but they are scattered throughout the city and they're in R5 too. So in R5 on an R7 sized or 7,000 square foot lot, going with the House Bill 2001 compliance, a triplex or a quadplex or a cottage cluster will be permitted in that R5 zone. So, and what I'd like you to think about is, does that line that outlines an R5 zone really mean that much? Like, if one of our proposals is that we might actually take away the line that separates R5 and R7 and say that's one zone, and what you can build there and the dimensional standards and the jello mold that you are allowed to build within, those are dictated by the lot size. So let's just get rid of this kind of artificial line that says it's R5 over here and it's R7 over here, because it really doesn't mean that much. It comes down to the lot itself. So if you look at this next map, you'll see our one of our basic options, and that would be, let me just talk about option 1 first, because it's kind of the minimal thing. You leave the lines in place, and eligible lots still are the way that housing types are located. You just basically leave the lines in place, even though they don't mean that much. Option 2 actually turns your 10 zones, 8 zones into 3. We would combine the R5 and R7. We would combine the smaller housing type lots, R3, 2.5, 2, and 1. And we leave the large lot R10 alone. So that's option 2. Option 3 is a little bit, goes a little further, but I think it's really important to consider. Should R10 be left alone, or should it be allowed to be somewhat subdivided? Again, let me remind people that this type of development is going to happen very, very gradually, on a lot by lot basis, mostly as property owners choose to. This is not the kind of law that developers are going to come in and raise buildings and build new development. It's mostly going to benefit the people who own property and homes in Milwaukee today. And an R10 lot, or a 10,000 square foot lot, and also R10 has a lot of lots that are bigger than 10,000 square feet lots. These offer a lot of options for middle housing. The larger the lot, the more flexible it is. Also, the more context sensitive can be the design. The more trees can be preserved. So all of these kind of good things increase when we have larger lots. That's just, I would like to put that question out there. Should we leave the R10 lot area alone, or should it be part of a big unified zone for the city? And in fact, I think we have these questions articulated on this next slide. Your choices then are to amend the code to permit the housing types on eligible lots, but maintain those 8 zones. So it'd be called our minimum compliance option. Choice 2 would be to condense the number of residential zones from 8 to 3, or include R10 in that bunch and condense the number of residential zones from 8 to 1. In that third option, it would be still the lot size that dictates the housing type and the building envelope, or the jello mold. So quickly, I'm going to go through this pattern guide for site design, because we have done a lot of studying of the context, the so-called, what I call the context, but it's really site studies based on actual sites within the city. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is, for lack of a better word, we're calling it Pattern Guide for Site Design, and it's a starting project to show how we respond to different site conditions found throughout the city. Obviously, not all residential areas in Milwaukee are alike. Different sites may require different approaches to form and to the building form, or that jello mold, what goes inside the jello mold, or parking and trees. And as we've discussed before, these kind of choices are called, we call them trade-offs, and there are many different ways they can, these items can be traded off to each other. So if I can show you the next slide, what we do know about in cataloging the different kind of forms and lot trees combinations throughout Milwaukee is that there are the 5,000 square foot lot, as you can see on the left. And then we have 2 examples of 7,000 square foot lots. We have a 10,000 square foot lot there shown to scale, so you kind of get a sense of how much bigger that is. And we have another type of 10,000 square foot lot shown there as well. Those are plans across the top, like looking down on the ground. And the white squares where a house footprint may sit. The orange is where the parking could be or is often. So for example, on the mid-century 7,000 square foot lot, the second from the left, there's also an architectural kind of shape that comes with that type of neighborhood. So when we say mid-century, these are neighborhoods that were laid out post-war, post-World War II in the 50s, smaller one, or wider footprint, but lower profile ranch type houses, often with a parking incorporated into the house form. And that's why you'll see that orange patch representing parking kind of outlined with white. That's supposed to symbolize that it's inside the house. That's a very commonly found type of house in neighborhoods. But there's also on the far left, the pre-war, pre-World War II, like more bungalow or Victorian era housing that is found. These are taller, typically 2 to 2.5 stories. And then you can see the options that become available when we start to look at the 10,000 square foot lot, how much more room and flexibility they may offer for all these different trade-offs. So that's just one of the evidences of our cataloging. The next map I'm going to just run through quickly to show you that we've been looking at different neighborhoods and measuring lot sizes, also looking at the way that these lots, the condition of the streets, for example, is there parking? Could you park cars on these streets? Do people park cars and how? And that is part of the parking study as well. Next. So this is all to set you up for the interactive exercise. We're going to spend a lot of time in this meeting running through in real time with you. And is this the point where I turn it over to Kimmy? Or Kimmy, did you want me to continue to go through the
We were going to take, we're right on schedule, which is great. We were going to take about 10 minutes to answer some of the questions that people have, big picture questions about the code concepts and the different scenarios, the lot size information that Marcy provided, the form-based approach. So we can, if there's big picture questions, that would be great. We'll also have time in the small groups to talk and answer questions as well. So Mary was going to ask the questions depending on who she saw, so she can see everybody.
We just have at least one in the chat that I see. And of course, if you can put anything in the chat or you can raise your hand as well, and we can go from there too. But I'll start with one in the chat from Counselor Beatty, asking, so talking about those Jello molds and if you put triplexes and quads in those Jello molds, does that mean they cannot be on separate lots?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I may also ask Vera to weigh in, but there's, no, they would be on the same lot. Triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters are all on one lot. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does, but it's different from what we discussed in prior, before this process and in the CPIC and then the comp plan. I do disagree with what was said in the FAQs about ownership not being a goal of our comp plan. Middle housing was a bigger goal, but ownership opportunities was definitely a part of that, and it is called out in the comp plan. And so finding ways to make, more ownership potential, I guess, and that's why so the follow-on question to that, I guess, about triplex is also about townhomes. how do you allow townhomes under the kind of concept that you were discussing, and how do you allow different lot sizes or you know, individually owner lot townhomes?
So the let me start with the triplex, quadplex, cottage cluster group of housing types, because yes, cottage clusters is one type that is often built in other cities with these cottages on their own lots. And the lots are often very small, like 1,500 square feet. And that is certainly an option. It's much more difficult. It would probably be a next step to this project because it involves land division. And it would involve allowing land division to be relatively easy to do in order to create a cluster of cottages that are each on their own small lot. The House bill took a simpler approach, and it said cottage clusters shall be required to be allowed, but they will just be on their own lot. They will all share a lot together. On the question of townhouses, I didn't bring this up because it's a step ahead, but we'll start talking about it. Townhouses have their own lot size. They're 1,500 square foot is the kind of average lot size that you're required to permit. And you are required to permit them anywhere, but it does require a land division before they could be built. Personally, I think they're a really wonderful option because it does provide a small home ownership lot. It doesn't do it, you know, as it won't be as easy to do that kind of development as it would be to say do a duplex, because it will require a land division first.
If I could jump in, Marcy, there are a couple of questions about if cottage clusters can they be fee simple? So can you own the cottage? And I think a triplex or a quad or a cottage cluster, those could all be ownership opportunities as well for the units, but it would be as part of a condominium development, right? So everyone owns, you know, a share of the land, but you can own the structure that's in it. So the group shouldn't assume that a triplex or a quad or even a duplex, frankly, are automatically rentals. They can be ownership opportunities as well. They just aren't on their own individual lots like a single unit home is, or like a townhouse is, the way Marcy was describing it, that they're attached homes on their own lots. We call them row houses in our current code, but that's what row house, townhouse, that's what the House bill calls them, but that's what we mean by those. So I just wanted to kind of to mention that.
So I saw Nicole has a chat, but also had their hand raised. So they wanted to know what's the main benefit of keeping R10 as a separate zone?
I have a hard time answering this question because I have a personal opinion about it. I think some people might say that, this is not my personal opinion, but some people might say it is important to keep these large lots large and have a kind of enclave of large lot somewhere in the city.
I'm going to jump in. Lauren has a question about between options 2 and 3, and I assume you mean about the zones, the residential zones. Does one support increased density better than the other?
Again, so I'll just jump in with my personal opinion. I do think that consolidating the lots probably won't make much difference in terms of increasing density, because these housing types will go in based on lot size. But the R10, incorporating the R10 into a unified zone and allowing R10 to be divided right now in R10, by being in an R10 zone, 10,000 square feet is the minimum lot size. And if you leave it that way, that will always be true. If you bring it in, they could be subdivided. They would, someone may come in, may take their lot and divide it into two 5,000 square foot lots, for example. And then you could probably build twice as much middle housing on those new 2 lots as you could. But today, those 5,000 square foot lots would be considered non-conforming. They would not be allowed to be created. So I believe that option 3 does provide a lot more housing.
Stefan, did you have a question?
Not a question. I just wanted to point out the prior discussion about ownership that that a number of these options would also lend themselves to co-op ownership, which is not something that we talk about much, but I think we're going to see more and more of it.
There's a question from Councillor Beatty. Just to be clear, when you say what House Bill 2001 requires, it requires that we allow those things in some areas of the city, but not necessarily everywhere, correct?
House Bill 2001 requires that you allow these housing types where a lot that's sized for them occurs wherever it occurs. So triplexes and quadplexes and cottage clusters are all targeted for 7,000 square foot lots wherever they occur, for example.
That was not my understanding of, and from the stuff you guys distributed before. So I guess I'll have to go back and reread. Thank you.
Well, is this a good time though, Councillor Beatty, to confirm that for you? I don't know that I want to leave that out and have us continue with this conversation. You may not be the only one who's confused or who doesn't understand or heard something different. So I just want to make sure that we're all clear.
I'm not clear either. There's been so much discussion about should we initially limit HB 2001 type development to arterials and transit corridors rather than opening up the whole city to them. There's been so much discussion about that in the last 2 years. And now what I'm hearing is something completely different, which is that we don't have a choice. It's citywide. And as a city, we're not able to do something like say we're going to do, again, encourage that development on lots that are on transit lines to encourage transit ridership. And
I would definitely say that David Levitan in the course of the CPIC meetings, definitely the read he gave us was that we had the latitude to decide on a corridor or a hub or various other configurations and not have it be every lot in the city.
Right. So, but what I'm hearing from Marcy is that it has to be allowed all over the city. So yeah, sort of like, what is it?
Well, we've spent a lot of time with House Bill 2001, and we've spent a lot of time with DLCD staff, and we're working on a number of this compliance projects in cities. So I feel completely confident in saying that these housing types are permitted on the lots where they are sized for. So again, duplexes are required everywhere. I don't think that's really in question any longer. Triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters are all required to be allowed on 7,000 square foot lots wherever those occur. And townhouses are required to be allowed on lots of 1,500 square foot average size wherever they occur or wherever they can be divided to occur.
And is there a minimum for townhomes? Is there I mean, you could have a lot where you could divide a 5,000 square foot lot into 3. So you could have 3 townhomes.
Correct.
Okay.
And maybe some clarification on previous discussions about this is that was before we had the model code from the state. Now we have the model code, and that is the minimum compliance that we have to do. So we were kind of doing guesswork of thinking what the state and the committee that was working on the model code would come out with. And now we have that. And that's why Marcy can be pretty definitive on what the lot sizes are now and kind of where that's going. As before, we definitely weren't sure how that was going to happen. And so it was kind of up in the air at that point. Yeah.
Well, I think the stuff you guys distributed about HB 2001's indicated that the model code was actually somewhat more aggressive than what the law requires. That there's
Yes,
That is
it
true.
is. Yeah,
Yeah.
the model code is intended to, and I was just speaking with staff from DLCD today about that, and the way Ethan described it is that the model code is intended to kind of be sort of the, it's an off-the-shelf code for communities to just pick up and adopt if they want to, and it's intended to be, it's a cherry-picked version of the House bill itself. So the ORS is, is the code itself, and it's intended to reflect the best practices to promote more opportunities to build middle housing. So it makes it easier to build middle housing, and that's kind of right from them. But and DLCD was required to create a regulatory mechanism, for communities that didn't make these changes that we're doing right now. And so that the model code is intended to represent the best practices as an off-the-shelf code. But there are aspects of the model code that are different, that are not the minimum compliance. For example, the model code includes setbacks of 10 feet for some of the housing types, as opposed to what our existing code says. But so that's why part of the question that Marcy has been posing is we have sort of the base minimum kind of compliance that we're required to make, in addition to implementing what our comprehensive plan says, of course. And then we kind of have this other end of that bookend, which is the model code, which sort of sets up some other standards. And so the question that Marcy posed earlier in her presentation about stretching, kind of what we're thinking about as far as that Jell-O mold, is something that we're hoping this group can think about. We have a minimum compliance sort of option, but we can stretch some of that a little bit to kind of think about maybe making a code a bit more flexible to be able to build more types of housing or more middle housing. But so that's part of this whole conversation that we're having with everyone, is where do we want to be on that spectrum of compliance with the code and implementation of the comprehensive plan.
And Vera, kind of going off of that, we have a couple of chats, one from Matt, and then also Micah chimed in. And maybe this will get into the stretching that you were talking about, of being able to go a little bit above that model code minimum compliance to encourage less parking near transit corridors, or incentivize that, or reduce parking requirements near corridors or transit corridors in general. And those are the areas that maybe we can stretch beyond the model code. Is that accurate?
I think that
Yeah,
would
I was
make,
asking you.
sorry, but I can just, but that's a way to get to part of what I think Ronell was talking about as well, is sort of this idea of being able to incentivize or focus, this kind of development in some of those sorts of areas. That's where you incentivize that, and you provide those opportunities. And I'm sorry if I cut somebody off. I'm sort of trying to answer questions. Apologies. I'm going to mute myself so someone else.
Dan, you also had a question stemming from this too?
I do have a related question, which is, I think it's a question for staff and consultants. Are there ways in which implementation of House Bill 2001 requirements, and particularly for where there's allowances for the triplexes and quadplexes, could have the effect of tying the city's hands in terms of future rezoning decisions, for instance, to allow mixed use along certain corridors? So that's something I'm thinking about, because I realize that this discussion is purely on residential zones, but there's a whole other portion of the comp plan that called for other kinds of zoning approaches. I think it gets back to some of the discussion that was raised about corridors earlier.
Did you want to answer that question, Vera? I'm not sure I totally qualified to.
No, I think it's a good point, and I'm writing it down so we can think about it a bit more. And I appreciate the question, because the way, House Bill 2001 is talking about these housing types, that they have to be allowed in residential zones. And so we, the way we're dealing with this now, I'm hearing a question about, well, what if we wanted to do some of these neighborhood hubs type of zoning, which would be a mixed use zoning, which is a different kind of zoning within our code. It's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer for you. I think it's a good one to kind of think about where we want to kind of deal with all of this, knowing that we've got a neighborhood hubs project kind of coming right up on the heels of this. So it's something to keep in mind. And I think we as a team will want to think about that a little bit more and get back to you on that. It's a good question to think about that. Thank you.
And then Dominique had hopefully a quick question about what is residential zone 3? Are you talking about R3 zone, which is one of our medium density zones? Is that right, Dominique? Yeah. Yeah, so that's one of our medium density zones. You'll typically find it closer to the downtown area. And it's kind of combined in with the medium and high density category.
Which we haven't talked about yet, but we will get to that in probably next time or the next time, but that is on the agenda to talk about. It's just not this evening. We have so many pieces to fit together and that just hasn't gotten to the table yet.
Sounds good. I was just trying to figure out where I'm at.
Yep.
And then Micah also had a question a little bit earlier that was about option 3, asking if 2 smaller lots could be combined and then pass as a certain size threshold to be allowed to build, say, a 4-plex.
And that is a really interesting question. I don't think there would be anything preventing that from happening because generally the zoning sets a minimum lot size but not a maximum. But also, we've seen a lot of middle housing developments around the country where someone will build one, they'll take 2 small lots and say they'll put a triplex on one and a triplex on the other and have a common green in between them. So it's like a cottage cluster, but it's actually onto adjoining, abutting or neighboring lots. So a lot consolidation, I don't think is as complex as a land division, which would be to divide a lot. However, it's still an extra process that might not be necessary to get some of the creative ideas that you're describing.
I don't see any final questions.
Why don't we go ahead on into the interactive exercise? And so with this interactive exercise, we have several questions. We're going to divide everybody up into groups like we did last time. We've got several questions that we want to ask you, many of which follow on this discussion kind of how do you do different things on the lot and get what are the trade-offs involved. If you could pull the slides back up, I think it would be helpful if Marcy could just kind of explain what the trade-offs are and what these scenarios are so everyone can start thinking about them, and then we'll dig deeper into them as we go ahead and go to the next one. We'll do this one in the group, but do you want to just talk through those, Marcy, and explain this so everybody's got the same base information, and then we can dig deeper into the small groups?
Yes. Okay, so this slide is just to introduce the scenarios. So imagine we have a typical 5,000 square foot lot on the left. The dashed white line is the setbacks, and that white patch is the 35% lot coverage, which just, if anyone is interested, is about 1,750 square feet on the ground floor. Imagine that then on the second plan in, we're looking at potentially a outline of a house. Say it's kind of a small L-shaped house, and we have all these trees on the site. And one of the trade-offs, for example, one of the more dramatic trade-offs that occurs, so I'm sorry, let me back up a second. So those 2 plans go with the Jell-O mold below. They show that jello mold that popped up to the maximum height, but with the daylight plane sculpting the sides off. So on the right, we have a plan that shows how parking can dramatically affect the jello mold. If you are trying to provide your parking spaces on site, as the two orange rectangles represent two tandem spaces, that would mean that you'd have to push your building coverage, maximum lot coverage of 35%, a little bit over. And that also may mean that you would need to remove some trees. So parking has a big effect. You can also see that by having the parking on the site there, it deforms the jello mold. It pushes it over. You still have your jello mold, but it has to take a different shape now. And there are points where your jello mold, by being deformed by things like wanting to save a tree or needing to put parking on site, can actually make you run out of enough of the area within the setback that you actually lose some of your jello. So next. So one of the interactive exercises, I believe, uses this parking trade-off. So we're showing 3 different scenarios where parking is handled in different ways. On the first one, and we're really pushing the envelope, so to speak, because we're talking about a triplex here on a 5,000 square foot lot, which is pretty, the 5,000 square foot lot's obviously going to be the most challenging, especially when you have things like trees on it and you don't have maybe abundant on-street parking and you want to provide your parking all on site, because you'll be parking, you can park 3 cars. You'll be required to park 3 cars. You could use on-street parking to count for some of those spaces, but most of the time you'll be parking them on the site. So you can see what we're able to do with the trees when we have on-street parking and we're using, on the left, 1 space on the street to count toward our 3 parking spaces. The orange patch, that's kind of sideways, that's a parked car on the street. That black line is supposed to be kind of like the curb. We've had to remove a tree to make it possible to put that parking there. And the building envelope gets pushed to the side a little bit. And so another choice that we have, this doesn't exist in your code today, this would be an amendment, and that would be to allow one of those parking spaces to be within the front setback. So the second illustration over shows that you could save a tree if you actually do that, if you allow that. You still get your 3 spaces, 1 is on street, 2 are on site. But 1, instead of being beside the house, is actually in the front yard, so to speak. And therefore, we're able to save a tree. In the third one over, where we're putting all 3 cars on the site, we're actually even deforming that jello mold even further, which means we may lose some of our development capacity on that site. But that's what it would look like if you were attempting to fit all 3 cars on the same site. And then there are some things you can do with building form. When I say building form, I mean, like, are these triplexes stacked one on top of each other, or are they actually 2 separate structures, for example? So on the left, we have the trees in the middle of the lot are removed because we're adding a building to the existing building to make 3 units. On the middle one, we're actually stacking some of that building capacity on top and therefore saving a tree, but we're making the building taller. Not taller than it's currently allowed to be, but we're using the vertical space within the jello mold more. However, we're minimizing the paved area and we're saving trees. And then on the third, we're actually making an effort to save those trees that are in the center of the site by separating some of the buildings. So we say have 2 units in the back and 1 unit in the front, and we have 2 separate buildings. Are there any questions?
So what we're going to do now is jump into our small groups and talk about what we're going to start with the big picture question that we asked you to think about at the beginning, about thinking about your neighborhood. What does zoning look like? How does that, do you know what your lot is zoned and what your neighbor's lot is zoned, and how does that change kind of what development is happening in your neighborhood? And then we'll talk about the different scenarios that Marcy went through. And as noted, there are some assumptions that we're making in those scenarios, some things that stay constant and some things that can change. And that's what we're going to focus on in the first couple questions. And then we'll focus into kind of like what other things can change. So as noted in the chat, we're assuming parking is 1-to-1, but as we get further down the road, further in the discussion, we can talk about the possibility of changing that and having that discussion. We are going to go into the small groups, and we'll come back as a full group in about an hour. So we've got lots of time for discussion. And Mary is going to put everyone in their small groups. And also noted, if you need to take a break, go ahead and get up and go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, and feel free to do that as we work in the small groups, because this is like intense, meaty discussion. There's a lot there, and it's going to be fun. So go ahead and put us in our small groups, and we'll see y'all shortly.
And I have us going until 8:30 with this exercise. Is that right?
8 o'clock, because
okay.
At 8 o'clock, we're going to come back and do report outs from the different groups and think about the report out. We want to hear from each group kind of what your key themes were. What areas did you agree on? Which areas did you have disagreements? Just kind of understand from you kind of what the key themes were.
All right, so I will click a button and you all should be able to go to your groups. So here we go.
So Vera, do you remember the session in your, whatever it was, environmental planning 401 or whatever the heck it was, on village homes in Davis, California?
I was just talking about that to somebody. I still have that book, Michael Corbett's book.
Right.
And that whole weekend away that we spent in Davis at Village Homes, it was awesome. Yes.
We just spent a part of our session talking about alleys and mini alleys, and anyway.
That was like a Disney development. It was just, and by that, everything was just perfect.
Here it reminds me, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. There is somebody, there's a group in Eugene that's working on all this stuff too. And they've already made design standards for the infill housing. And I send it to you.
Please do. Yes.
Like all worked out, like talk about sort of in a box, you know.
Let's do it.
But with all the kinds of things that, you know, I think most of us would like to see. So I'll dig that up again.
If you can think of it, that would be great.
Yeah, I made a note and I'll
wonderful
to you. I got it.
Another one worth noting in the Portland area is Eli Spivak and Orange Spot. Some amazing developments there that are kind of hitting some of those ecological points that I think you're the one you're referring to in Davis, California. It's kind of designed to touch on some more ecological function and creative use of space, really strong on the placemaking, and not just multiple units on a lot, but how they are even oriented to create a common space. Just really cool stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I always loved the idea of that, how Village Homes was designed solely for stormwater. It ended up being this great, you know, but that stormwater management was what drove that design right out of the gate. It's awesome. Yeah, it was really cool. It's a great place. I think they still have a waiting list to get in. I think you still can't get in there. It's great.
So looks like everyone is back. So I hope you had good, fruitful discussions. Our discussion was really good. And again, we could have still used more time, even though we were talking for an hour. So what we'll do now is just go through and do report outs from the different groups and think about the key themes, kind of where there was agreement, where the group didn't agree. Just kind of share your key themes, and each group's got about 5 minutes, so you actually have quite a bit of time if you want to share. And I think our group is the group 1, which would be Micah, is going to report out for us.
Could you potentially pass so I can?
So you can read the notes. Is
Yeah,
any group ready to be first? Does anyone want to volunteer? Vera?
Sure, if that's okay with my group, I can. Okay, and please chime in. So my group were the folks from the public, the public group. And for the most part, I don't think we actually had very much disagreement in my group, except for the planting standards for replacement plantings. We had one member of our group that thought it was okay to have smaller trees, and another member that thought, no, we should be bringing in the huge, mature ball and burlap trees. So somewhere in there, we think is the perfect solution. But height and setbacks definitely matter for middle housing. There was not a lot of appetite to go to 3 stories, and certainly not any taller than that for middle housing, unless some pretty extensive mitigation is talked about, to go to that height. There was quite a bit of concern about how all of this will work with lot consolidation. Both of the folks that were in my group are in the Ardenwald neighborhood, and there are a lot of larger lots that have a lot of large backyard lots. And there's concern about how lot consolidation works, and could we end up with developments that have 50 or 100 units in it just by virtue of consolidating lots, and what kind of review happens for that, making sure that there is input, public input, that this process doesn't kind of disallow or remove public input from larger projects like that. There a lot of talk about any kind of stretching of codes definitely has to have mitigation, including trees, pervious pavement, stormwater, and trees were something that that the group talked about quite a bit, and making sure that we're thinking about other than people in this code, and we're thinking about habitat and climate as well as we're doing that. Definitely okay to have parking in the setback. So that was something that that folks agreed on for sure, and that in many cases it's probably more ideal, but it's definitely okay to have separate structures as part of a duplex or a triplex development, that they don't have to be attached. It's okay for them to be detached, and we should kind of stretch our understanding of those housing types for that. If we're going to talk about increased lot coverage, again, back to mitigation. There should be trees, there should be other things that that get counted in for anything like that. It seemed to be, I think, okay to have from the required parking, one of the parking spaces be on the street, but we're not going to get away from not having to require off-street parking. That just seems to be something, we acknowledge the future of cars is hopefully going away, but we're not there yet. And we do need to think about that, but it matters what the street conditions are, and we should be building out the streets to be able to accommodate that parking, but more importantly, rethinking street design so that pedestrians and bikes are being designed for better. And can we consider angle parking instead of parallel parking? Is that something, or is parking on one side of the street? And so that just the whole idea of rethinking street design is something that we should be thinking about, so we can get away from car-centric street design. And it seemed that there was certainly openness to thinking about consolidating to the 3-zone option, so the option 2, if I have that correct. So that was something that that was thought about. And at least in the Ardenwald neighborhood, the notion of having duplexes or triplexes or multifamily, that's all happening in the Ardenwald neighborhood right now. So if folks want to see what that looks like, you can go to Ardenwald. So it's not that strange of an idea to have different kinds of housing types in the Ardenwald. It's really about, it's the form-based idea and making sure that setbacks and height and all of those things and lot coverage are regulated is what makes that work for the neighborhood. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. And I don't know if Lisa or Renelle or Natalie have anything to add to that. Thanks very much. It was a great discussion. And when I said we had 15 minutes left, nobody could believe it. So it was kind of, what? We got through that hour pretty quick.
Yeah.
So thanks very much. Great discussion.
Thank you. Good report out. What group wants to go next? Are there any volunteers?
We're happy to go next,
Okay.
mostly because everybody in our group had a long day, so I volunteered to report out for us. So we had a lot of agreement as well, and really valued the extra time to discuss things. And I'll keep our report out brief in case anyone in the group wants to add something. So we talked about how zoning is, those distinctions between the different residential zones aren't really felt as much as that a lot of variation in a neighborhood between different lot sizes, and then different housing built at different times. You know, a 1920s bungalow next to a mid-century modern ranch home. So that's much more how we experience zoning. The one exception is the large lots. There's an interest in acknowledging the agricultural history of Milwaukee. And that's something that those larger lots do speak to. Not necessarily preserving large lots, you know, in the exclusive residential sense, but there is a desire to acknowledge that agricultural history as the city continues to grow and develop. The parking, we were ready to go bold. We were definitely fine with on-street parking counting, but we did have some questions about the logistics of that and how you can reserve, you know, an on-street parking space. Does that person actually have their parking spot all the time? And also there's some difficulties if a street isn't fully built out with a curb, and if there's issues around where to park. We were okay with the idea of looking at reducing the parking, particularly in areas with strong transit, because that allowed us to preserve more trees, more open space on the site, and we were definitely okay with parking in that front setback area. Our group really was drawn to the idea of allowing units to be detached from one another in that triplex, and the flexibility that that brought to site design. You know, that allowed, let's say, in that co-housing model that Stephen put forward of having a shared common space and different units around it. We also really liked that it would allow some agriculture on that site if people wanted to do that, and just having the flexibility to get different designs. And I think that's it. Did I, oh, I'm sorry. One last point is we looked at increasing the size of the Jell-O mold. We really didn't have enough time to get into that. It's a large discussion we wanted to have, but we were willing to potentially look at increasing that mold specifically for, let's say, an affordable housing development or lower income housing, to give back that, to encourage that type of development, to increase opportunities. And I would ask if anyone in my group, if I missed something that you wanted to raise.
Oh, I just typed it into the chat, just pointing out to current agricultural use. There is historical, and oftentimes there's like a generational dip, but we're definitely on the upswing of that curve. So just kind of thinking about current use and kind of reinvigorating latent agricultural production in the urban environment.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you.
Micah, do you want to report for our group?
Yeah, I can go now. So yeah, I'd say amongst our group, we pretty much landed together. So for question one, all of us generally don't notice zoning changes within our neighborhoods, especially at the lines. They seem fairly arbitrary. and lot sizes don't seem to be connected to zoning in our neighborhoods. And the separation kind of feels excessive. And we prefer more of the, more of an urban built feel, with easing of setbacks, and having smaller setbacks and more flexibility. So around trade-offs, so we wanted to rethink one of the requirements specifically around parking, and we talked about why is there a minimum parking requirement, and especially when considering all of the different goals of this project and the city's goals around climate, around producing more housing, and protecting more trees. It seems like parking, allowing flexibility in parking would allow those other goals to move forward. So we talked about like just eliminating the parking minimum for certain redevelopment situations, which will help, help reduce our reliance on single occupancy vehicles, boost use of transit, and make our communities more walkable. As we then talked about the building form, we talked about the need to consider flexibility, and the allowance of, there might be better to trade off frontage improvements to provide parking. Quality of the built environment is as important within these conversations. So for question 3 about form and around building height, we thought it would be important to see real world examples of what additional height might look like, but in situations where if we're trying to protect trees on a lot and require or incentivize more affordable housing on a unit or on a lot, might we be able to add some height to a project if one of the units is kept at an affordable level and a certain amount of trees are protected? Like thinking about that sort of incentive, how that might play into this. We talked about, with that additional height, might we have to consider other development code, specifically around fences, because I think right now the limit is a 6-foot fence. For different scenarios around for number 4. So to really, as we're talking to within ourselves and to the public, to really ground ourselves that this this code and the change that it's going to bring is really going to be iterative and piecemeal, and it's not going to happen at once. So if we are going to no longer require a minimum amount of parking on a site, like that isn't going to have a huge impact to a neighborhood as a whole, if it's happening one at a time. And that can also coincide with trends for us moving away from owning more and more vehicles. So really expressing that to the public, that yes, we're looking at all residential zones for this this project, but it's going to happen very slowly and very piecemeal. So as we talked about the reducing number of zones, I think we all agreed that simplifying to 1 or maybe 2 zones probably made the most sense. We were having a conversation around some of the natural resource zones in the city and how those zones also have larger lots because they're protecting a stream or a wetland. And so in order to reduce the impact of natural hazards and to continue to keep that flood capacity in those natural spaces, we might want to limit the development in those specific parts of the city, but not necessarily in all R10s. Like a lot of the R10 within the city should be considered applicable to this code. And yeah, do other folks from my group have anything else to add? It was kind of all over the place, sorry.
Great, thank you. The last group is Marcy and Layla's group. Who's reporting for you guys?
I will report for us. Layla took excellent notes. And like the other groups, our group was very thoughtful. I'm really amazed at what we covered. We didn't answer all the questions, though I probably didn't do the best job facilitating, but I'll just go through what we talked about kind of in order. In terms of understanding or encountering zoning, we had a really good representation in our group because we have people who've been applicants and people who've served on commissions and people who have much, long decades of planning experience. So we had kind of a range. Some people understood the historic significance of what we're doing and the kind of racist history that comes from this single family zoning that is in place. Other people said that the current system is complicated and not very intuitive, even as someone who might be supposed to know it well, like serving on a commission, that users of the code are often frustrated in the process of trying to do something like design an ADU. There was a lot of interest in questioning absolutely every single dimensional standard. Why, for example, do we have a setback? What's the reason for the front setback? Let's just, since we have this opportunity, and this is kind of a once in a lifetime exercise, let's question everything. So I'll get into more detail about some of those discussions. We did talk about parking quite a bit. I think people generally agreed that that parking space that could exist in the front yard should be allowed to count. That makes sense. It's often paved anyway. There should be limitations, though. I think was also general agreement that it shouldn't be allowed that you paved your whole, or you gravel your whole front yard and allow head-in parking, because that doesn't provide the neighborly feeling that we want to see in neighborhoods. So maybe it's a limitation on the number of spaces that are allowed to occupy that space. And also that curbing streets or having a defined edge, maybe not necessarily curb, having street design, street construction would actually help define the areas for parking. And also that there are really different parking situations throughout the city. Some very busy streets probably won't ever be able to accommodate on-street parking. And that should be taken into account when we're talking about where people are going to park in those neighborhoods. People are concerned about the amount of paving, though. Like, we talked to some extent about what kind of parking creates the most paving. And we talked about that since the street is paved already, it kind of makes sense to use it for parking. A tandem parking spot on a site is actually a very efficient form of parking. If you're going to pave it, it's minimal, whereas kind of a shared surface lot might be somewhat problematic because there's more paving. Although you can use pervious pavers, you can actually use that kind of parking lot to treat stormwater. We talked about alleys, that they can be good, but they also have their downside. They can be good. It's hard to retrofit a city that doesn't have alleys, but there was some interest in this idea of an alley end or kind of partial alley or a shared parking space that served multiple lots or a small portion of a neighborhood, say, where you could leave your car in a shared lot, not have to park your car in front of your house or on your site. There was also interest in, as we move to electric cars, where are those chargers going to go? It doesn't it's problematic to think of everybody pulling a cord out from their house across the sidewalk, you know, to the on-street parking space. Should we be thinking about how we accommodate electric cars? And then there was also discussion about utilities and undergrounding them, how after the recent storm, maybe this is an opportunity to kind of think about the streets, think about the utilities and all of this at one time. There was some discussion about the fact that the tree code is going to be adopted in companionship with this code. So people are concerned about losing trees, but the city will have tools that it didn't have before. And there will be much more pressure to design around the trees than there has been. So on the front yard, people really, there was a good discussion about the purpose of front yards, why it would not be desirable to just give up the 20-foot setback, but have homes directly back of the sidewalk, that might be too. The things that are good about the setback are the layers of privacy that it provides the dwelling. And maybe there's some middle ground, maybe 20 feet is too much, but certainly 0 is probably not. I didn't see agreement on that, but I saw interest in pursuing that idea further. And I think that's kind of it. If there's anyone from my group that wants to offer something I missed.
Great job, Marcy. You covered it.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Those are really good feedback. Seems like there's general agreement about parking, about being able to have more flexibility in parking and where it is and what's counted towards parking and how much parking is required. And also the preservation of trees and the trade-offs involved, and meeting, using some of these requirements or use the flexibility to help meet other city policy related to like the attainable housing and tree preservation and such. So that was good stuff. We were just going to spend a few minutes and talk about these themes in general. Marcy, is there any other, based on what you heard, is there any other information that you want to ask the group to help with this next phase of the work, the technical work that you need to do with the codes and taking it from code concepts to more specific things? It seems like people were definitely interested in looking at things, setbacks and the building heights and that trade-off part of it anyway, the form of buildings and such.
I guess one thing I don't have a clear picture of, and part of this is my fault because I didn't ask my group this, but on the zoning question, did the other groups, I think, had on the 3 zoning choices, there was some really good group thinking about that, but I don't have a clear direction. Maybe it's not possible to. Did anyone hear that in the report outs?
What I heard was that the zoning as it works today with the number of zones and everything doesn't work, and there needs to be a change. What that change is, I think people were all over. Is that a fair assessment? If CPIC members, if you're interested in sharing or commenting, go ahead and type something in the chat or raise your hand and Mary will call on you.
Renee, go ahead.
Well, I know we're not dealing with open spaces and the other parts of the comp plan during this phase of the project, but when you're talking about the zoning, if you're not also talking about how to maintain open spaces, then before you know it, you don't have open spaces. So that's a big concern of mine, and I don't know at what point it becomes part of the discussion.
Can I ask, Renee, can I just ask a follow-up? What do you mean by open spaces? I just don't know what you mean. Do you mean the yards on people's private property, or do you mean open space like parks and that kind of thing? I just wanted to clarify that if you could.
I guess what I mean is a little bit of both of those. Like, big areas that allow for, you know, wandering in a sense. I mean, literally, I guess, you know, not just your front yard, not, you know, something between your front yard and going out to the gorge, you know, where you have green space, a place to meet up with neighbors or see wildlife or breathe some fresh air. And of course, I'm drawing on my own experience, which is I'm sitting right next to literally a 3.5 acre parcel almost that is a open space that could be maintained as an open space if somebody, the right person, wanted it to be, not person, but confluence of factors. But most likely, because of everything we're doing, it's going to be subdivided and built. And so once that opens, what I'm calling an open space, it's a potential, has potential tree canopy that's not individual trees. It has potential wildlife corridor that is already part of a larger wildlife corridor that will diminish that overall natural resource. You know, it has potential community gathering space and all sorts of other environmental issues around it that may be lost. And I'm sure that that is not the only example. So that's kind of what I'm referring to. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I was clear on it. Thanks.
I guess I could add to that question just a little bit, which would be, is there like some kind of a weight towards maintaining a very low percentage of structure in places that are surrounded by or in very close proximity to existing waterways or wildlife corridors or green spaces? And I think we talked a little bit about that in the CPIC. And we were talking about the Willamette green space, but the conversation went beyond just that particular designation. Where Renee is and where I am are very close. My site where I'm now is an example of a site where the property owner downzoned it from probably R10 to open space. And my understanding is that's a method that property owners can use, and it's a very small buildable space where I am now. But is there something even in between the open space zone and the function of having space remain open for all other types of human and non-human uses besides just dwelling at a 35% coverage?
Does somebody at the city want to address that? Or is that just something you want us to consider as we're going through this code change? Code update?
Might be nice to have it be a conversation, not necessarily in this meeting, because I know that we're getting close to the end of it, but I'm also interested in hearing where this goes.
Thank you.
Stefan, you had a question about the R10 zone?
Yeah, so what occurred to me is that I don't have a very good feel for what there is out there that's zoned R10. And what would help me probably would be just aerial photography so we could walk along and you know, that aerial photography that included lot lines and obviously existing buildings relative to those lot lines, so we could actually get some feel for where that fits in the three scenarios that were outlined. I had no problem with the first two, but when I got to the third one, I thought, well, I don't really know that much about what is R10 in this city.
So I can, it might maybe, I'm just looking at the time. And so if it's helpful, we can do that now because I have the GIS map right now. Or I can provide a GIS map with, with the aerial, and I can outline where the R10 zones are on an aerial photo, and I can email it out to everybody
I think
tomorrow.
that's good.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's
okay.
great.
I'll do that tomorrow.
Thanks.
I mean, I will just say I said in my group that I was surprised at how little R10 there was. I thought there was more R10 in the Hector Campbell and Linwood areas, and that there was none there really surprised me. I mean, the two that I saw on the map were Waverly, which are those big houses next to the country club, and then a chunk of Lake Road. And some of that on Lake Road is going to be these long properties that back up to Kellogg Creek. But others of it is going to be more traditional, residential streets. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for all of that discussion. This for me at least was very helpful in helping to get some more feedback kind of on what CPIC members particularly, but what the public might be thinking about this, which kind of gets into our next steps for what we need to do next. Yeah, Vera.
Sorry, Kimmy. Joseph has his hand up for a comment as well. Nope, yep.
Yeah, I was the only one that actually raised the hand feature, but what I heard was that there's a lot of support for consolidating the residential zones, that it's overly complicated the way it is now, that it doesn't really align with the feel of lot sizes throughout the city. And in a lot of cases, we know that it's based on, on racist policies, from 60 or 70 years ago. And so it sounds like there's a lot of support for really rethinking that. I think that there still is, it still makes sense to have larger minimum lot sizes in certain cases. And, really that's what everyone's been talking about for the last few minutes that I was excited to get in on, is the natural resource zones and natural hazard zones. And, we don't have dedicated zones for natural resources. We have, overlays that, fit within the other zones, the other base zones, whether it's, a commercial or an industrial or a residential. So we need to really think about how we protect these natural resource areas in the residential zones. And larger minimum lot sizes is one way that we could consider doing that. And it's, in a lot of cases, again, the current zoning is irrational. And so you have, like R5 in the Willamette River Greenway in some cases, but then you also have, like in Waverly, those R10 lots. And so, it's just, if we were to rethink that, it shouldn't be based on historic patterns. It should be based on the natural features that are present on a site. And it should be, if it provides a benefit to preserving those features, because we still need this to be clear and objective. We still need a clear and objective code that will allow for the protection of these natural features. So is a couple of different zones, including, one with a larger minimum lot size, one way that we accomplish that. And that's what, I think that, we maybe start from the default position of really residential land is residential land, but then is there a specific set of policies or goals in the comp plan that has been adopted that would be better satisfied by introducing a different zone with a larger minimum lot size or larger setbacks or, something along those lines. But really the standards that we adopt should directly intersect with our policy goals.
Yeah, just to crib off that a little bit, I really like the framing of that all residential become residential in a very generic way. And then within the natural resource zones, whether it's like we increase the cost to remove trees, or if we completely prevent removal of a certain percentage of trees in those spaces, or completely prevent development within the floodplain, to both, yeah, to protect those natural resources, but also to protect the communities around them, because they're often serving lots of different functions like flood abatement and cooling and creating that open space that that is important for neighbors, as the residents themselves.
I just want to add a thought here is that I love all of those ideas, but I think the execution of them is very complicated and could be rife for unintentional policies that we are now currently trying to undo. Like, for example, if we prescribe these kinds of things for certain properties that are now privately held, they could tip the scales to affluent landowners whose properties then are more valuable because, or less valuable because they are in these natural resource areas, or they either become coveted or they become property that nobody wants. And then if you overlay that currently, you're always going to be imposing it upon people who already own the property. And private property, as we know in America, is like this very, it is like one of the great American rights that we protect. So I love that. I love the idea. I'm having a hard time understanding how we can do it in a way that will not be unfair to certain populations ultimately, and overlay into someone's private property, which everyone's very protective of what they own, because it's their lifeline usually. So it's just a thought I want to throw out there.
Just want to double, Micah, you have your hand up. Do you have more comments to? No, I just wanted to make sure. Okay.
Great.
Okay.
I just, Vera, if no one else wants to go, and I am abysmally late tonight, so apologies, but I'm just going to jump in here. I think that's a very interesting point, Jennifer. And also, I think that at the freedom and opportunity to purchase property is the risk that something is going to change at any point. And from being in the real estate industry, there are a lot of things that can affect property value, north or south, that are outside of a property owner's control. And for me personally, what we're talking about here when we talk about natural resource protection and really prioritizing, both human and non-human uses for the land that I think we're stewarding here, that is of extreme importance, and to me is worth it. To me is worth any discomfort or displeasure for somebody who feels that their property value has shifted as a result of the shift in the zoning code. And additionally, I think any zoning code change we make is going to impact, property values. And so we just have to take that as a given. So if we're gonna change it, I'd rather change it for reasons that align with our comp plan policies and our goals and hopes. But I do understand that it's a challenging place to be making those changes.
Just to be super, super clear, I'm referring to, let's say, somebody who lives in a floodplain now who owns their home, maybe because their parents left it to them, but they are living in the 60 to 80% AMI bracket, and then their one asset that they own is devalued and they have no control over it. That's one example of a way we unintentionally negatively affect a population that we're trying to help, and that it would need, I think it would need some analysis about who lives in those areas, and would it displace them, or would it hurt them financially by doing so. I'm less concerned about those who have resources. I'm more referring to people who don't have options other than where they live.
This points to how complicated all of these decisions are, and how we really do need to think about all the consequences, and it's challenging. And so just to, I want to make sure we get out of here on time, since we did extend it by an hour. Just go over the next steps really briefly. I wanted to talk about the upcoming, the two next steps are the public engagement that's going to happen and the refined code concepts. So just as far as the public engagement goes, there was a memo in your packet that kind of talks about what we'll be doing next, but just to quickly summarize, we will be doing a virtual open house on Engagement Walkie like we did before, and that is supposed to open on March 22nd and will be open through April 8th, and we'll also have a community survey aspect of it like it did last time. Then as part of that, we're also doing the meeting in a boxes, which is basically the city's working on presentations for that. A lot of those will guide people to the virtual open house, so kind of set up the discussion and then send people to the open house site so they can participate in the survey that way. And so at our next CPIC meeting, we'll actually be kind of doing a dry run with you to do that, because if you remember, we did ask the CPIC members to help with those meeting in a boxes, and it's really to, there's kind of three ways that we could use your help. One is to assist staff with the meetings that are already scheduled, so participate in those meetings and take notes and help listen to the discussion to make sure everything is captured, and attend. Second one is just to attend and listen to what people have to say, and then bring that back to the next CPIC meeting in April. That would be. And then the third way is just to spread the word. Last time, I believe everybody got an email to send out to your groups to let them know to participate. And same thing this time, we'd like you to make sure and spread the word so we can get more people to participate. As we did before, we are working with, we're going to have information translated in Spanish, and we'll have paper copies available, and just want to really try and reach out to different groups. And so we will be working with the city's equity manager to make sure that we reach those groups. He's also offered to, in addition to helping us get the word out, to review our materials and make sure that everything is that the right language is used and everything. So that's the plan with the outreach. And then, Marcy, do you want to talk about the refined code concepts and the FAQs?
I'm sorry, what am I supposed to say about them?
What you're doing with the refined code concepts, kind of what's the next step in the process?
Yes, okay. So a lot of these ideas, the general code concepts that we've discussed with you this evening, we also need to vet those with staff, with the tree board, with people who would be administering these, with and see what they think, what kind of ideas or pauses some of these concepts give them. So we're going to be setting up a number of meetings between the 15th and well, basically for a month, starting in a couple of weeks. And we have, as you know, people on our team who are experts in parking utilization, and tree codes, and urban arboristry, and planners. So we'll be tagging along at many of these meetings with staff to listen in, and that material will come back and inform a refined version of the code concepts, which will actually become the code amendments themselves. And then your meeting in a box feedback will also inform.
If I could just jump in, some of those technical meetings will also include the city engineer, because a lot of, what we've talked about included, street design. And while we're not redesigning or we're not redoing the public works standards as part of this project, it's important to have the city engineer kind of part of that to see what that's going to mean for frontage improvements and for hopefully be those revisions that might be coming down the pike. And we're also including the city attorney in these early discussions to help us make sure that troubleshoot any or identify any red flags early on before we get too far down the actual code language process. We don't want those kinds of surprises late in the day. So just wanted to add that to the layer of technical reviews that we're going to be coordinating over the next month.
And we did say we would provide a little opportunity here at the end to talk about the FAQs if anyone had other questions that needed to be answered or had questions about those FAQs. So again, if you want to raise your hand or type it in the chat, that would be great, and Mary can.
I think Councillor Beatty has her hand
Yeah,
raised.
this isn't actually about the FAQs, but it's a question along the same lines as them that came out of tonight's discussion. So, and I think it'd be helpful to have some clarification as we go forward. So there was talk about being able to build your triplex in pieces, not as one piece. So how is that different than a cottage cluster? And how does that work with the state law that says you have to allow an ADU on every property? So it'd be good to have some clarity about how all those things work. The separate triplex or quadplex, the cottage cluster, and the ADU.
I'll try to answer that, but it also sounds like maybe we'll issue a FAQ update. Those are really good questions. I have the same question myself because these types start to merge and become similar, and what's the difference between a triplex and cottages. So cottages are actually, they have a definition per the House Bill 2001. Not that a city couldn't vary from those to some degree, but they're supposed to be 900 square feet footprint maximum. That means where it hits the ground. It could be a little larger, and they're also they're allowed to have surface lots shared together on a. They're required to have some common open space. So it's kind of like they're different from. Say you could do a triplex. Say you did a quadplex, and they were small, and they were all on the same lot. I think we're kind of asking the question of, well, how is that different from a cottage cluster? Well, you could make every item in every unit in the quadplex a little bit bigger than 900 square feet. There's some discretion there. You do not have to provide some shared open space. But with the cottage clusters, particular housing type that is intended to be more affordable. And so it's limited in its square footage, but in exchange for that smaller square footage, you do have to provide some shared open space. And then how is that different from an ADU and a primary dwelling? And these do become a little interesting puzzle pieces. A duplex, how is a duplex different from a primary dwelling and an ADU? It's basically, these could be two dwellings of the same size. Whereas right now, an ADU has to be less in size than the primary dwelling. But otherwise, they're quite similar. I think the intention is to provide a lot of options. Does that answer your question?
I guess. And it will be, so like a lot that has a quadplex, whether it's one building or 4 buildings. I mean, I still don't, know how that you'd get much bigger than 900 square feet footprint if you're gonna have lot coverage maxes, but say you could also still have an ADU, right? Because we have to allow an ADU on every lot. Or does that rule not apply once we've gone to multi-unit development on that lot?
Yeah, I think that's the question.
Was that the question that I missed? I'm sorry.
Well, that was part of it. I mean, it was all mixed in there, but.
Now, this is something I think cities have some discretion. You have some choices about this. But it's my understanding that you're not required you don't have to allow you're not required to require an ADU. You're not required to set up your code so that an ADU is allowed in addition to a quadplex.
Okay.
You could, but I guess I'm kind of not sure. So that would allow you to have 5 units on a lot instead of the 4. That's something that we could certainly discuss if there's interest in that.
I'm not necessarily advocating that. I'm just trying to understand the parameters of what is allowed or what
Some
is.
cities are doing that. Some cities are allowing an ADU in addition to a plex, a triplex, a duplex, or a quadplex.
But are they single building, triplex or whatever, or detached? So I guess what I'm understanding the question being is, if you have the detached version, is the ADU still kind of like a requirement, or is the ADU requirement only for single family house or something?
An ADU is just another option now. You can build a primary dwelling. I mean, with your primary dwelling, you can add an ADU. You could add 2 units. Also, if you're in the zone, in the lot size that allows a triplex, you could add another couple of units to make your primary dwelling and those additional units the triplex. And if you allow these to be detached, in addition to attached, then there's flexibility, obviously, and these can be separate units, separated.
I think if I'm going to speak for staff, that we're going to put together some information that we'll send out to everybody that clarifies this question specifically that Councilor Beatty had, and then specifically talk about this question of, you know, where do ADUs have to be allowed? You know, if you do have a triplex, do you have to allow an ADU with a triplex in whatever configuration it is? So we can put a chart together that just kind of gets into some of the weeds of the code of how they work together, because House Bill 2001, you know, talks about these forms, and it doesn't really talk too much about the ADU piece and how that configures in with it. So we'll glue all that together and get that out to you. It's a good question now that we're starting to get into the nitty gritty of it. Thank you, Councilor Beatty.
Mary, is that all? It's
That
9
looks
o'clock.
to be it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all for the great discussion tonight. It was very helpful and I appreciate it. Our next meeting is March 18th, same time, same 3 hours. Hopefully we might be able to get out a little early that time. We'll try. And we will be doing the dry run of the meeting in a box. So if you are interested in helping with that facilitation and attending those meetings, probably the easiest thing, Vera, would be just for them to send you an email expressing their interest, and then Vera will coordinate on when the meetings are.
Yep, I can put a schedule together and just let everyone know what ones we've already scheduled. We were hoping to do one of these sort of facilitated groups with folks who are renters specifically. And I know that Sharon, I believe, you know, who's one of the member of our committees, and I'm going to be reaching out to her as well. But if you folks have, you know, sort of a particular kind of, you know, group of renters, and that's a group that we wanted to make sure that we reached out to. We had a kind of a large majority of folks that responded to our first survey were homeowners, and we wanted to get a perspective of renters. So if folks have, you know, a collection of renters that are your friends and you want to put together a meeting, we can do that too. So but that's one particular group that we were hoping to reach out to specifically, but I'm happy to send out to everybody kind of, here's what we have scheduled so far, and you're more than welcome. And one of them for sure that we're going to is we have scheduled to be at all of the NDAs for their March meetings, but I'll send out a schedule and let me know if you'd like to participate, or you can just show up as well. So we can do that via email. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think we are adjourned. Does that sound good? Okay. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. That was
Thank
great.
you, everyone.